The morning after I buried my wife, the bank called me. I thought it was about the funeral expenses. Instead, the woman on the phone explained they had frozen a large withdrawal for security reasons and needed me to confirm my signature. My blood went cold. I hadn't authorized anything. I sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee, staring at my wife's favorite mug. My hands still smelled like lilies from the graveside when I realized the money had been taken, and the only people who could have done it were my own children. Mr. Reynolds, just to verify, the signature on transfer was yours, correct? I asked her to repeat herself, thinking maybe I was half dreaming. She read out the amount, $50,000. Gone. And the account holder of record? Still me. I told her I never signed anything. There was silence, then she carefully said, "Sir, the signature matches, but if you'd like to dispute." That's when it hit me. Someone forged it. And not just anyone. Only my own kids had access to those papers. I wanted to vomit. My wife wasn't even in the ground 24 hours, and already my children had carved me up like a carcass. That night, I sat in the dark, shaking. Every memory of raising them, baseball games, scraped knees, their first apartments, I replayed them all, wondering how the hell they could betray me like this. I thought about confronting them directly. I imagined screaming in their faces. But then another thought wormed its way in, darker, steadier. Don't let them know you know. Because if they thought they'd won, maybe, just maybe, I could make them pay in ways they'd never see coming. And that was the night I decided I wouldn't just get my money back. I'd take something far more valuable. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my recliner, the old one with the torn armrest, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the house sounded like a whisper of betrayal. By morning, I knew I had to see the papers myself. So I went to the bank. The teller, young kid, nervous smile, pulled up my account and slid the documents across the desk. My own signature stared back at me, but it wasn't mine. The loops were too wide, the slant too sharp. It was like looking at a bad photograph of your own face. And then I saw the name. My oldest son. Not written, not signed, just listed as authorized representative. I felt the floor tilt under me. "Mr. Reynolds, are you saying this isn't your authorization?" the bank manager asked gently. I swallowed my rage and forced my voice to stay even. "No, it's fine. Everything's in order. I just wanted to double-check the details." Inside, my blood was boiling. But I needed to know where the money was going, who was pulling the strings. If I filed a report right now, maybe I'd get some of it back. But I'd lose the element of surprise. They'd know I was onto them. And I wasn't ready for that, not yet. I left the bank with the papers tucked under my coat, my heart hammering like I'd just committed a crime myself. That evening, I had dinner at my daughter's house. She poured me wine, smiled too wide, and said, "Dad, you really should let us handle your finances now. You don't need the stress at your age." I looked her dead in the eye and smiled back. You might be right. Inside, though, I was shaking. Not with fear, but with rage so sharp it tasted like metal. And here's the worst part, while I sat there nodding and eating her casserole, I noticed a stack of envelopes on the counter. One had my name on it. Bank correspondence. Unopened. They weren't just stealing from me. They were managing me like a puppet. That night, as I walked home under the yellow streetlights, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't scream, I wouldn't confront, I wouldn't collapse. I would smile. I would wait. And then I would gut their little empire from the inside out. But first, I had to know how deep the rot went. 3. When I said I wouldn't scream, I meant it. What I forgot to say out loud was that I also wouldn't freeze. I would move. Quiet as a cat in a house that thinks it's empty. The next morning I started small. I made excuses. I liked to read my statements with breakfast, and I showed up at my daughter's like a man with nothing to hide. She handed me a stack of mail the way a magician palms cards, casual, practiced until it looked like kindness. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked, and there was that same too bright smile from the night before. "Fine. Just tired." In the car, I riffled through the envelopes. Junk mail, medical flyers. And then, an invoice from a name I didn't recognize, Havencrest Holdings. No logo, no explanation, just a balance due on an account I'd never opened. A breadcrumb. That night, I filed an official request for a full statement of my accounts. I claimed I was reconciling taxes after my wife's funeral. Routine. Legal. No reason for them to suspect anything. 2 days later, a courier arrived. "A mistake," they said. A paralegal at the small law firm my children used had mailed my copy of an authorization transfer to my address instead of theirs. I signed for it like it was nothing but insurance paperwork. Inside, statements, signatures, and a fresh link to Havencrest Holdings. My hands didn't shake when I saw my oldest son listed as authorized representative. The shock burned cold, but I forced myself to read everything twice. If I screamed now, I'd lose the element of surprise. Later that week, my son Mark called and asked if I'd stop by to help him with his new drone. I said maybe. I needed to look normal, harmless. At his house, I planned a quick in and out, just enough to check the kitchen drawer where he kept bills. But he hadn't left for work. His girlfriend was there, perfume heavy in the air, laughter like tassels. "Dad," she called, too brightly. Mark appeared at the stairwell like a shadow. "I thought you were at work," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Traffic," he shrugged. "Sit. Stay. You okay?" I sat. I drank coffee. I smiled and pretended my hands were steady. But inside, cold sweat prickled my spine. My plan was patience, not exposure. While we fiddled with the drone, my eyes caught a shoebox under the side table. When I reached for it, my fingers brushed an envelope with my name scrawled across it in my daughter's handwriting. Time slowed. I pulled it out, the seam split. Inside, more bank letters, statements, a hospital bill, details about my own accounts. "Dad, what are you doing?" Mark asked. His girlfriend looked up, amusement flipping to thin concern. I forced a mild smile. "Just tidying up. Thought this was addressed to you by mistake." I handed him the papers like a man handing over a confession disguised as mail. He flipped through slowly. For a second, the mask dropped, fear, then anger. He set the envelope aside carefully, like it was hot. "You all right, Dad?" his girlfriend asked. "Fine," I said. My voice was sandpaper. "Just tired." They didn't press. I walked out with the drone box and a smile, and wanted to cry with relief and with rage. That night, sitting on my stoop, I looked up at their windows. Light leaked like secrets. If Mark had flipped the envelope too fast, my whole advantage would have evaporated. But between the missent documents and that strange invoice, I now had a name to follow, Havencrest Holdings. Not in my memory, not in our family stories. A dead end of a name, but names can be doors. I whispered it into the night like a prayer and a threat at once. Havencrest Holdings. Then, as if the universe wanted to laugh at me, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Stop nosing around, old man." When I said I wouldn't scream, I meant it. What I forgot to say out loud was that I also wouldn't freeze. I would move. Quiet as a cat in a house that thinks it's empty. The next morning I started small. I made excuses. I liked to read my statements with breakfast, and I showed up at my daughter's like a man with nothing to hide. She handed me a stack of mail the way a magician palms cards, casual, practiced until it looked like kindness. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked, and there was that same too bright smile from the night before. "Fine. Just tired." In the car, I riffled through the envelopes. Junk mail, medical flyers. And then, an invoice from a name I didn't recognize, Havencrest Holdings. No logo, no explanation, just a balance due on an account I'd never opened. A breadcrumb. That night, I filed an official request for a full statement of my accounts. I claimed I was reconciling taxes after my wife's funeral. Routine. Legal. No reason for them to suspect anything. 2 days later, a courier arrived. A mistake, they said. A paralegal at the small law firm my children used had mailed my copy of an authorization transfer to my address instead of theirs. I signed for it like it was nothing but insurance paperwork. Inside, statements, signatures, and a fresh link to Havencrest Holdings. My hands didn't shake when I saw my oldest son listed as authorized representative. The shock burned cold, but I forced myself to read everything twice. If I screamed now, I'd lose the element of surprise. Later that week, my son Mark called and asked if I'd stop by to help him with his new drone. I said maybe. I needed to look normal, harmless. At his house, I planned a quick in and out, just enough to check the kitchen drawer where he kept bills. But he hadn't left for work. His girlfriend was there, perfume heavy in the air, laughter like tassels. "Dad," she called, too brightly. Mark appeared at the stairwell like a shadow. "I thought you were at work," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Traffic," he shrugged. "Sit. Stay. You okay?" I sat. I drank coffee. I smiled and pretended my hands were steady. But inside, cold sweat prickled my spine. My plan was patience, not exposure. While we fiddled with the drone, my eyes caught a shoebox under the side table. When I reached for it, my fingers brushed an envelope with my name scrawled across it in my daughter's handwriting. Time slowed. I pulled it out, the seam split. Inside, more bank letters, statements, a hospital bill, details about my own accounts. "Dad, what are you doing?" Mark asked. His girlfriend looked up, amusement flipping to thin concern. I forced a mild smile. "Just tidying up. Thought this was addressed to you by mistake." I handed him the papers like a man handing over a confession disguised as mail. He flipped through slowly. For a second, the mask dropped, fear, then anger. He set the envelope aside carefully, like it was hot. "You all right, Dad?" his girlfriend asked. "Fine," I said. My voice was sandpaper. "Just tired." They didn't press. I walked out with the drone box and a smile, and wanted to cry with relief and with rage. That night, sitting on my stoop, I looked up at their windows. Light leaked like secrets. If Mark had flipped the envelope too fast, my whole advantage would have evaporated. But between the missent documents and that strange invoice, I now had a name to follow: Havencrest Holdings. Not in my memory, not in our family stories. A dead end of a name, but names can be doors. I whispered it into the night like a prayer and a threat at once. Havencrest Holdings. Then, as if the universe wanted to laugh at me, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Stop nosing around, old man." After that text, "We need to talk. Stop nosing around, old man." I slept for 2 hours and woke like a man who'd been skinned and sewn back together. Sleep doesn't heal what betrayal cuts, it only dulls the edges for a bit. I had a new problem now. They knew I was poking. That unknown number was proof they were watching, and if they were watching, then any misstep might blow the whole thing wide open. I decided to change the play. No more sneaking into their homes. No more rifling through envelopes. If they were defensive, I would go quiet and become patient like winter. I would make them comfortable and then move. Of course, life has its own rhythm of catastrophe, and ours came in the predictable form of a hospital call. My neighbor Nora rang my bell like a church bell, urgent but oddly gentle. "Your son called," she said, handing me a paper with Mark's handwriting, scrawl, impatient. "He said come to the ER. Moms," she trailed off, eyes soft with the kind of sorrow that makes you think you should drop everything. "Which son?" I asked, although it didn't matter. I felt the floor tilt again. "Both? Everyone. They said you should be here." At the hospital the fluorescent lights hummed with their own sort of gossip. The waiting room smelled of bleach and stale coffee. I sat on a plastic chair, feeling like a relic in a museum exhibit labeled Unreliable Patriarch. People came and went, a nurse with a brisk ponytail, a young man apologizing on the phone, an old woman knitting with the sort of intensity that implied she'd learned to survive on small stitches. They gave me a pager and then led me into a corridor where a social worker, a pleasant woman named Rachel with a name tag, sat behind a folding table and smiled like it was unpaid emotional labor. "Mr. Reynolds? Your son said you were under a lot of stress." "I'm here for my wife," I said, and the words weakened because my wife was still in the coffin and my children had already taken the keys to my accounts. The hospital was a theater of other people's dramas that mirrored my own. The man 2 chairs down murmured about insurance. A teenager in a hoodie cried into his palms. Rachel asked questions I had rehearsed in my head and then decided to ignore. "Who handles your finances?" she asked, pen poised like an executioner's blade. I could have said, "I do." I could have been the upright pensioner who fights for his rights. But I had learned to keep my face blank, to let them think what they wanted. So I said, "My children help me with some things." She nodded and then, in that soft, inevitable way social workers have, mentioned something that made my blood run like cold syrup. Sometimes families file for guardianship when a parent is grieving. It's common. It helps with bills and decision-making when someone's not able to manage. My throat closed. "We'll manage," I said. Short, final. When they called me back to the intensive corridor, something about paperwork and next of kin, I followed like a moth to a bad light. In the hallway I passed a janitor leaning against a cart, and he muttered, "You okay, old-timer?" I wanted to tell him everything. Instead I tightened my jaw and kept walking. The family cluster in the corridor was like a court in session, my children in a semicircle, voices clipped, smiles thin. My daughter had that practiced sympathy you wear like a sweater. Mark stood with his chin raised, the posture of someone who expects the world to keep paying his rent. "You should sit, Dad," my daughter said. "You look pale." "I'm fine," I lied. My mouth tasted of copper. They briefed me on the latest, insurance forms, a doctor who wanted signatures, a directive. Each time they needed authorization, they reached for a stamped, ready-made solution, the photocopied signature I'd seen weeks ago. I listened. I nodded. I let them talk. It felt like being at my own funeral while they negotiated the flowers. Later, as the hum of the air vents sighed above us, my daughter stepped aside with the nurse and spoke in a voice so low I could hear the scraping of the floor. "We can't keep him like this," she said. "He's been confused. He missed the funeral registry meeting, The nurse tooted sympathetically. I felt my face harden with a heat that had nothing to do with fever. I would have preferred a direct fight in the living room, at least then I could look someone in the eye. But this was more insidious. They were building a case. They wanted the paper that would make me manageable, legal, official, permanent. I left the hospital with a bruise on my forearm from the hospital wristband they'd given me. In the parking lot Nora passed me a paper bag of tomatoes like contraband. "Keep your chin up," she said, and for a second I wanted to throw the tomatoes at the drive-through window and watch them splatter like warnings. Back home, the anonymous text replayed in my head. "Stop nosing around, old man." They were not only stealing, they were trying to intimidate. I felt outrage, sharp, clean, but also a cold calculation. If they were trying to make me seem incompetent, I needed to become the opposite, lucid, boring, annoyingly present. I needed to be the kind of man who, when challenged, didn't look like a ripe target. So I started small. I called the bank and, calm, even, asked for a copy of every transaction in the last 6 months. "Routine," I said. "For my records." The teller's voice was helpful, friendly. She didn't ask questions, that would have been suspicious. Then I did something I'd missed the first time, I checked the courthouse records for any filings. Simple public documents, nothing fancy. Guardianships, POAs, property transfers. The records were a quiet thrum of bureaucracy, and in them I found an entry that made my heart stop, a form filed 3 weeks prior, power of attorney, signed by me, dated the day before the funeral. I stared at the typed name of the notary and the signature block. The signature looked like mine. It looked like the photocopy I'd seen. But I knew I hadn't signed that document. Had I? Memory is a treacherous thing. Grief makes you question whether the world is a photograph or an oil painting. I called the number for the notary listed on the filing. A woman answered in a voice that could stretch across a grocery aisle and back. "We handle lots of documents," she said. "What do you need?" I asked for the original. "For the notarized copy." She paused, a small fissure. "We can send a certified copy. There's a fee." Careful, patient, methodical, that had become my mantra. I paid the fee. I sat at my kitchen table like a man waiting for his mail, and when the envelope arrived I opened it with the ritual of a man opening a verdict. There, in thick paper, was my name and that phony signature beneath the notary seal. I placed it under my lamp and studied it until the numbers blurred. The signature was mine, pretending. It had been notarized at the tiny office downtown, the same place I had visited once to sign a car lease a decade ago. My throat tightened with the familiar project of anger. Did they forge a notary stamp too? I was halfway between fury and despair when my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered on instinct. "Stop," the voice said, mechanical and cold, as if it had rehearsed the word. "We warned you." The line went dead. I realized then the truth that had been gnawing at the edges. They hadn't just skimmed accounts. They'd built legal scaffolding. Guardianships, POAs, LLCs like Havencrest Holdings, a quiet architecture built to make invisibility a legal fact. And whatever I did next would have to tear that scaffolding down before it locked me out of my own life entirely. So I sat there in the lamplight, my coffee gone cold, and thought of the one tool they'd underestimated, my ability to be patient and fake my own brokenness until they let their guard down. I would play that role to the hilt. Worse, I would weaponize it. I would become the man they wanted me to be, and while they relaxed, I would work. But just as I started sketching the first step, a visit to the notary, a confrontation disguised as confusion, my upstairs neighbor banged on my door and thrust a yellowed envelope into my hands. "Found this slipped under my door," she said, breathless. "It was addressed to you. Says, keep safe." I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet, photocopied, with a faint, shaky note in my own handwriting. "If anything happens to me, read the safe. Lr." Underneath, someone had circled 3 words in a different hand, "Safe code, 729. My heart lurched. Lr, my wife's initials. The safe. The code. A lead I thought had been erased by grief. And then my phone buzzed again, another text, the same unknown number. This time the message was short, almost casual. "You should stop. Or it gets worse." I looked at the note, then at the photocopied power of attorney, then back at the text. The lines of the house blurred into a map of traps. Whoever had left the photocopy had purpose. Someone was playing a game inside a game. I clenched the paper until it creased. My plan, be the passive old man, lure them with complacency, felt suddenly fragile. Because they could, apparently, manipulate more than papers. They could manipulate the narrative about me, about my memory, about my competence. And as I stood there with my wife's initials and a code burned into my knuckles, the phone rang again. This time the caller ID read, "Mom's Hospital, Room 14. A nurse's voice, "Mr. Reynolds, this is Nurse Patel. We need you to come in and sign a change to Mrs. Reynolds' directive. It's urgent." My chest slammed. The paper trembled in my hand. I stood in the hallway with 2 roads in front of me, the hospital on one side, the safe on the other. Both smelled like traps. Both pulsed with the fingerprints of my children. The phone kept ringing, the nurse's voice still echoing, It's urgent. Come sign. Urgent, in their language, meant, hurry up before you notice what we're doing. I didn't go. Not yet. I chose the safe. It sat in the back of my closet like an iron coffin. Dust clung to the dial. My wife had always insisted we keep it, for emergencies, and I used to joke that the emergency would be me forgetting the code. 729, my hands shook as I spun the dial, and when the heavy door gave way with a sigh, I nearly collapsed with it. Inside were only 3 things. A photo of us, young, standing in front of the house the year we bought it. A manila folder, swollen with documents. And a small jewelry box with her wedding band inside, the one she hadn't been wearing when she died. My throat closed. I opened the folder. Page after page of statements, receipts, letters. But at the very back, folded small, was something else, a handwritten note in her tidy, looping script. If anything ever feels wrong, remember the safe. I left things here you might need. That was all. No accusations. No warnings. Just her hand reaching out of the past in a quiet way. I sat there in the dark, my wife's voice crawling out of the ink, and for the first time since the funeral, I cried. Not because of what I lost, but because she had left me something solid when everything else was slipping away. That night I didn't sleep. I sat with the folder in my lap, memorizing each page, each date, each number. And as dawn stretched gray across the blinds, I made a new rule for myself: no more reacting. If they wanted to play games, I'd set the board. Later that day, while I pretended to be on the phone in the hallway, I overheard my daughter telling Mark, "We checked the safe. It's empty anyway." They thought they were a step ahead. But it was the first time I knew for sure they were watching. And the first time I felt, quietly, that I was a step ahead of them. Before I could even sketch the first move, the hospital called again. This time, not a nurse. My son. "Dad," he said, his voice all syrup. "They need you here now. Just sign the directive. It's standard. Mom would have wanted it." I pressed the phone hard to my ear, staring at the folder in my lap. "Don't worry," he added. "We already filled most of it out for you." I walked into the hospital like a man whose body had forgotten the sound of his own footsteps. Each tile clicked under my shoes like a drumbeat announcing my arrival, and I wondered if anyone noticed the way my hands barely trembled. In room 14, my children were waiting like actors in a play I hadn't auditioned for. My daughter's smile was tight, too bright, and Mark leaned against the wall, casual, arms folded, scanning me like I might collapse at any moment. A nurse, clipboard in hand, gestured at the forms on the bedside table. "Mr. Reynolds, we just need your signature on these updates to Mrs. Reynolds' directive." I picked up the pen they pushed toward me, the weight of it heavier than iron. I could feel their eyes drilling into my skull. One wrong move, one hesitation, and everything I'd discovered, the safe, the folder, the note, could be undone. I paused. "Do I need to read all of these?" My voice was calm, almost bored. "Oh, no, Mr. Reynolds," my daughter said smoothly. "We've reviewed them. We just need your signature. It's routine." Routine. They were trying to make betrayal feel like toothpaste, smooth, invisible, necessary. Through the open doorway drifted another voice, low and tired. A social worker speaking to a colleague at the nurse's station. "Guardianship cases like this are always messy. People think it's just signing papers, but it's a whole legal process." Their heads flicked toward the sound. Mine stayed still. I tucked that overheard sentence away like a blade in my pocket. I signed the forms, but I signed only what was necessary. My pen hovered, and I added a tiny, deliberate curl in my signature. Not for a notary, not for them, but for a court. A future handwriting expert would see it for what it was: proof. Evidence. A breadcrumb only I could follow back. They didn't notice. I left the hospital with the folder and the sense that I was walking through a minefield. Every step mattered. Every casual glance could unravel me. Outside, The morning sun glared like judgment. I thought of the letter, the safe, and the little clue my wife had left. They had underestimated me, and I intended to make them pay. But there was a new problem. Someone had been in my house, the cracked window, the fluttering curtain. They might know I had the folder. They might know I had the code. My advantage had narrowed. That night, I went through the documents again, cross-referencing the photocopies, notarized forms, and bank statements. Each piece was a map of deception, and I realized I needed allies of a different kind: patience, cunning, and the pretense of weakness. I plotted the next step carefully. I would bait them into overconfidence. Let them think they were in control. And then? I decided it was time. The waiting, the listening, the notes from my wife, it all pointed to one thing: test them. See how far they would go. Let them expose themselves. I called the bank under the guise of curiosity. "I'm considering a transfer," I said, voice steady. "But I need to confirm the account number first." The teller, helpful and cheerful, repeated the details aloud. I made a note. Nothing seemed odd yet. Then I called Mark, pretending to be confused. "Son, do you know if I need a witness for this transfer? I don't want to make a mistake." Silence. Then a cough. You don't need one, Dad. It's fine." Bingo. My first signal. They assumed I was still naive, still compliant. That weekend my granddaughter stopped by after school. "I found it in my room," she said, holding out an old tablet. It was my wife's, the one she used to read recipes and keep her lists. I thanked her, smiled, and put it aside until she left. Later, alone in the quiet of my kitchen, I opened it. The password was the same as always: our wedding date. Inside, buried under shopping lists and family photos, were folders I'd never seen, PDFs of bank transfers, drafts of legal agreements, messages between my children about transitioning control. My wife had saved everything. Not for me, perhaps, but for herself. Or maybe she had hoped I would find it. It was all there: dates, amounts, names. Even a mention of Havencrest Holdings tucked into an email chain like a splinter. I scrolled, heart hammering, until the screen blurred. This wasn't a decoy. This was real. And now it was mine. That night they invited me to dinner. "Just a family evening," my daughter said brightly. "Relax. We'll cook." I went. I played my part. Ate their casserole. Laughed at the right moments. And when they thought I was asleep in the recliner, wineglass empty, eyes half shut, I heard their voices drifting from the kitchen. "He's going to notice eventually," Mark muttered. "Too late now," my daughter whispered back. "We already checked the safe. It's empty anyway." A pause. Then lower, sharper: "Just keep him calm until the paper's clear." I kept my breathing slow and even, like an old man dozing. Inside, my pulse thundered. They thought the safe was empty. They thought they had time. They didn't know about the tablet. When I left their house that night, I felt something new settle over me, not just anger, but clarity. They had shown me their plan. Now it was my turn. By now, I knew them better than they knew themselves. Their greed was predictable. Their paranoia, fragile. And if I pushed just the right buttons, I could make them collapse under their own schemes without lifting a finger. It started with a casual conversation at the grocery store. I mentioned to the cashier, loud enough for a nearby shopper to hear, that I was considering transferring some funds to a trust I'd read about in the paper. Mark, who had just walked in, froze like a deer in headlights. He glanced at my shopping cart, at me, then at his sister, who was already whispering, "Do you think Dad knows what we did?" That's when the fun began. I started slipping subtle hints, leaving letters half visible on the counter, mentioning Havencrest Holdings in passing when they were around, asking random questions about investments I'd never made. Their reactions were instantaneous: eyes narrowing, conversations whispered in corners, phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. One evening, I overheard my daughter on the phone, voice tight. "Mark, do you think Dad found the original documents? He's acting strange." Mark replied, irritation in his tone, "It doesn't matter. We just need him to sign next week. Everything else is covered." Their arrogance was my ally. They believed the photocopies had misled me. They thought they were ahead. They were wrong. A neighbor, passing by my fence while I watered the garden, remarked casually, "You know, kids these days think they can outsmart their parents. Sometimes it backfires." I nodded, pretending to tend to my tomatoes, while inside, I was already drafting the next stage of the plan. I sent another subtle probe, an email to Mark, phrased as if I were seeking financial advice. Nothing suspicious, just a question about a small investment opportunity in Havencrest. Within minutes, I received a call, not from Mark, but from my daughter, demanding to know why I was sending emails about finances. The seed of doubt had sprouted. They were starting to suspect each other. Their alliance, once solid in greed, was cracking. The psychological game was working. Every hint, every casual mention, every small reaction I elicited gave me more control. I could manipulate them into revealing how far they had gone, without ever showing my own hand. That night, I reviewed the real documents from the safe, the folder, the letters. I mapped out their transfers, their fake accounts, every notarized paper. I realized I had everything I needed. They had laid the path for me. Their arrogance was a roadmap, their greed a compass. The walls of the house seemed smaller now, or maybe it was me. Every glance, every footstep echoed like a warning. I could feel the tension in the air, thick as molasses. My children were starting to turn on each other, and I was the quiet observer, the predator pretending to be prey. It started with an argument over the kitchen table. "You handled it wrong," my daughter snapped, slamming a stack of papers down. "He could have noticed." "Not my fault," Mark shot back. "I followed the instructions exactly." I sipped my tea and nodded politely. "I just hope everything is in order," I said, careful to sound oblivious. They didn't notice that I had already memorized every signature, every transaction, every account. Their anger and blame were exposing details I hadn't yet known, the hidden accounts, the offshore transfers, the shell companies under aliases I'd never heard before. Later, while they bickered about whether the bank had questioned any of the transfers, I left the room quietly and checked my safe. Inside was the folder, untouched. The letters, the documents, the plan, they were still mine. I realized something crucial: their suspicion of each other was stronger than any plan I could make. They were slowly unraveling themselves. Every phone call I intercepted, every whispered conversation I overheard, fed my understanding of their strategy. Then came a near disaster. I had left one decoy email in the sent folder, accidentally addressed to Mark instead of my fake address. He opened it immediately, reading the line, "I might be checking Havencrest Holdings tonight, just to be safe." My heart leapt. I had almost been exposed. If he had mentioned it aloud, my whole advantage would be gone. But instead, he muttered under his breath, frustration sharpening his tone, "She's messing with me again." Perfect. They were already suspecting each other. I didn't need to say a word. That night, I sat by the window, reviewing the notes from the folder. I mapped a final sequence, small provocations to heighten their paranoia, enough to make them move rashly, exposing all their misdeeds in plain sight. The breadcrumbs had been laid. The trap was ready. And the stage for the final act, where their greed, arrogance, and betrayal would collide, was set. I woke up that morning with a quiet certainty. Years of patience, observation, and hidden strategy had led to this. My children's greed, arrogance, and paranoia had built the perfect stage for their downfall. I invited them over for a family meeting. The excuse: I wanted to discuss the estate and make sure everything was in order. They arrived, smug, confident, unaware that they were walking into a trap they had laid themselves. I sat at the head of the table, calm, tea in hand. "I've been reviewing some old documents," I said, flipping open the folder from the safe. They leaned in, curiosity flickering. Slowly, methodically, I laid it out, the fake transfers, the notarized forgery. Each revelation was a scalpel, slicing through their bravado. Their faces went from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to fear. "You thought I wouldn't notice," I said, voice steady, eyes locked on Mark. "You forged my signature, you manipulated my accounts, you turned my grief into your profit. And yet, here we are." My daughter tried to interrupt. I held up a hand. "Please. Let me finish. You've been careful, I'll give you that. Almost too careful. But you forgot one thing: patience, observation, knowledge, and a folder hidden in plain sight." I handed each of them copies of the documents I had reconstructed, every illegal transfer, every forged form, every sham LLC. I watched the color drain from their faces. The weight of their crimes, once invisible, now lay before them like stones. "And the best part?" I said, voice low, simmering with satisfaction. "All of this is documented, notarized, and ready for submission to the bank and authorities. I didn't need anyone else. I did it myself." Mark's hands trembled. "Dad, I cut him off. "No excuses. Every move you made," I noted. "Every lie, every misstep, every betrayal. You wanted control, and I let you think you had it. But control is an illusion. And now, you see the truth." They slumped into their chairs. My daughter buried her face in her hands. Mark stared at me, silent, speechless. I smiled, a small, cold smile. I had my money back. Every dollar. My wife's wishes were honored. And their arrogance exposed for the world, or at least for themselves, to confront. Later, alone in my study, I reflected. Revenge isn't about violence or screaming. It's about patience, precision, and letting someone's own flaws destroy them. And as the sun set over the quiet street, I poured a glass of whiskey and whispered to myself, "Justice isn't loud. It's meticulous." Patience and careful observation can be more powerful than brute force. Greed blinds, arrogance exposes, and betrayal carries its own weight. True revenge isn't immediate, it's deliberate, and it lets the betrayer fall by their own hand. If you enjoyed this story of cunning, betrayal, and careful revenge, subscribe for more tales of ordinary people taking extraordinary actions. Comment below, what would you have done in his place?